and you'll see my timer's going there, Dylan. So I'm really trying hard to keep to your 20 minutes. But what I'm going to try and show you is just a snapshot of the West here, and sort of the labor's kind of strike activity in the West throughout the 1900 to the Second World War period. So I'm just gonna blow that up so you can see it. So if you look at the Western Canada as a whole, to understand Saskatchewan in the pre-World War I period is to understand a very muted, a very quiet, and a very small organized labor movement. If you were interested in working class issues in the West in the pre-World War II period, British Columbia and Alberta were really your place of interest, to a lesser degree Winnipeg and Manitoba. So this is just strikes in Western Canada. I counted them up, and you can see that British Columbia really leads the pack. Alberta is quite second, and Manitoba, except for that brief spike in 1919, which many of you will know as the Winnipeg General Strike. Saskatchewan is by far and away the least militant form of working class politics in the West. And I can show that to you in a bit more detail. 1901, 1945, BC and Alberta are dominating strikes in Western Canada. Primarily, this is coal miners, gold miners, miners of all stripes, early industrial work, and so forth. But when you compare it to what's happening in Saskatchewan and Manitoba, you can really see Saskatchewan's right at the bottom of that list. There's really nothing happening in Saskatchewan with regards to worker strike activity, which gives us some emphasis on workers in Saskatchewan in general. Saskatchewan is primarily an agricultural province. There's not a lot of organized working, there's not a large organized working class in the province. Where we do see organized working classes in Saskatchewan in the pre-World War II period really is in railway towns like Moose Jaw and Regina, a little bit in Swift Current, almost nothing in Saskatoon, a little bit, but not a lot. It's a very non-homogeneous, or sorry, it's a very homogeneous organized working class. It's mostly men, they're mostly white, and they're mostly in the skilled trades or on the railways. And they're largely in what we would today call a craft union sort of model, which was quite conservative, not really radical in its orientation. And when I say radical, not attracted to socialist, social democratic, or anti-capitalist politics in the way that many of the working classes in Western Canada in the early 20th century were, especially in British Columbia and Alberta. And I know some people might be surprised by that. Alberta actually was one of the highest strike-prone areas in the country in pre-World War I periods, but primarily in the southern area around the Crow's Nest Pass and in the coal mining and hard rock mining areas in places like Blairmore, Alberta, etc. So you can just, I just show you that strike activity to give you a sense of how Saskatchewan was quite quiet in the lead up to the Second World War, which might surprise you given that we have a very rich working class history in this province, but I want to get into that in a little bit more detail. So here's the broader snapshot. So after 1945, suddenly Saskatchewan's working class is a much more, I'm not gonna say interesting place, because there are very interesting pockets of working class activity between 1900 and World War II. It's just not as loud on the provincial scene as it was in places like British Columbia or Alberta. That continues. British Columbia really does set the tone for working class conflict in the post-Second World War period, although you'll see the trend is to fall. But when we break it down by region, BC certainly leads the way. Suddenly Alberta looks very quiet. It's very conservative. It has one of the weakest trade union acts in the region. But look at Saskatchewan. Look how much it changes after 1945. Now I'm going to go into those numbers a bit more detail, but you do see that Saskatchewan really starts to ramp up its working class activity with regards to militancy and political involvement by the 1960s, and certainly takes off in the 1970s. Now, some of this is directed at the federal government and its wage and price controls, but it does sort of have a broader effect in the provincial movement as well. So that's a broad snapshot of working class militancy and activity over about 100 years. And I did that in about 5 minutes. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It might be bad actually, but I'm happy to take criticisms for glossing over many things. Okay, so we get this sort of broad sort of analysis of what's happening with regards to working class militancy. Now let's break it down in a little bit more detail. Okay, so I'm just gonna, this is just a slide I have sort of altered from some of my teaching, and I will just go through this. So to talk about
Charles.
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but
No, interrupt.
I'm just going to ask a bit of an accessibility question. So with some of these charts and graphs, if you're able to just point out the spikes, for instance, just give a little bit more of that data input.
Sure. I'll get into that for sure. Yeah, like these are accessible. You can see these.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
All right. So, okay. So, obviously the period but in the 1930s and 40s is important and probably like essential to understand the organization of workers and farmers into the construction of the creation of the CCF, which becomes the NDP. I'm not going to get into that history too much, other than to say that in Saskatchewan and Alberta, these two places where the CCF is created, in first in Calgary, then in Regina in the 1930s, what we're talking about is a movement dominated by farmers with a small but vocal presence of the organized working class. Now, it's different in places like British Columbia and in Ontario, but the roots of the party very much begin with this farmer coalition that brings in elements of the working class. And there's all kinds of historic struggles, and I'm happy to talk about that in the question period with regards to like the Estevan strikes in the 1930s or the On to Ottawa trek in the 1930s, which I think does have some resonance for understanding some of the politics today. Well, in fact, they're quite different, but I can see why people draw parallels. I can talk about that if you'd like, but I really like to get in the relationship with the party and how the party is so effective in, I think, bringing something to the table that institutionalized labor relations and allows labor to grow into what it is today, and I think helps us understand the relationship between the party and the state and organized labor. So throughout the Second World War, we see a vast improvement or growth in working class material lives, and the party benefits from that. Labor expands rapidly in the industrialization of the period, and the unions at the time, the two large central unions, the CCL and the TLC, are growing massively, and labor is left out of state plans during the war. There's all kinds of frustration that collective bargaining is not recognized. There's all kinds of strikes. The state basically treats them the same way it always had, which was to crush them, or at least to ignore them and let employers sort of, essentially defeat the organized working classes. There's no legislation protecting workers. It's really fight or flight for working people. And this changes in two ways by the middle of the war. One, there's a political party forming that comes out of the West, but actually has really, I think, dedicated organizers, people like you're seeing in front of you. David Lewis in the bottom right-hand corner is someone you'll be familiar with. Tommy Douglas, obviously. Ted Jolliffe at the bottom here. And you see the growth of this movement. And one of its key demands or key sort of hopes for the success is to align with the organized working class and be the sort of wing of the party. Now, there are other elements here. There's the communists and others, but I'm not going to get into that too much. We can talk about that if you're interested. There's a movement to recognize compulsory collective bargaining. The Liberals finally concede in 1944. I'm happy to share these with anybody who's interested, because I am going to move pretty quickly. But just to give you a snapshot of all these things that are happening, PC 1003 is the first moment in time when the Canadian state recognizes collective bargaining, but it's weak. It has a very limited list of unfair labor practices. They don't ban company unions. Strikes are highly regulated. So labor is very critical. Now, the CCF's calling for a much richer code, but they don't hold power, except in 1944, they win a victory in Saskatchewan, as you all know. So this is a snapshot of the Saskatchewan CCF's 1944 plan for labor if they win in Saskatchewan. The CCF does win in Saskatchewan. They promise to bring in a new trade union act as part of their campaign, and you can see that there in the right-hand corner. You can see sort of their their labor plan, the number 8 being the one I'm focusing on, the right of collective bargaining. And what they do immediately, so I'm not kidding when I say immediately, they're elected in the spring of 1944. They spend the summer drafting a draft trade union act that's done very much in smoky rooms to create an act that's going to outshine the federal Liberals. And there's two goals here. One is to bring in a trade union act for Saskatchewan, but the other is to be a model act that the CCF can point to elsewhere in the country to say, if we win here, we will bring you this legislation. So what is included in this act? It's legal collective bargaining, a legal framework to organize, a legal right to strike, administrative structures to help administer this outside of the courts. They grant public sector workers the right to bargain and to strike. That's the first in the country. It doesn't happen anywhere else in the country until the 1960s. Saskatchewan's 20 years ahead of the game on this, and it clearly bans company unions. There's no wishy-washy liberalness to this bill. It is very much directed at helping working people organize. And I want to emphasize that, to organize. It's not a perfect act, but it's a pretty good one. Sorry. And I want to emphasize this, and I've talked about this before, so some of you will have heard this before, but like if we were to just implement this act today, you would not believe the pushback you would get, because it actually does things like employers can't threaten employees or fire them for inactivity, which we're familiar with, but we know employers can skirt around that pretty easily when it's not enforced the way it should be. Employers cannot threaten to move operations to avoid union organizing, which we know happens today, but it takes a clear stand in Saskatchewan. They expand the number of unfair labor practices in ways that I think today would shock a lot of people. So for instance, if an employer just refuses to recognize a union, kind of digs in and says, I refuse or forget it, the state had the ability through Section 13 of the 44 Act to take control of that private business for violation of the Act. And that's a pretty impressive remedy. It does get used once time quite aggressively, but it kind of faded away. To me, that's a very powerful signal that we will defend your rights if your employer will not recognize your legalized rights under the Collective Bargaining Act. They take a clear stand on union security, and they really open it up to make working people organize in ways that are effective and can be administered quickly. So you can really see, obviously, the pro nature of the act. You can see that the Regina Leader Post, which was notoriously pro-liberal and anti-labor and hated the CCF and was, always calling them communists, were quite nervous about this act. They see the sharp teeth in the Labor Act, and the editorials would make you laugh if you read them. They are quite, essentially, according to the Leader Post, it was going to be a Stalin's Russia before the end of the first term. They were very concerned about that, which we obviously know was quite laughable, but it was certainly laid out in their editorial page. So this is why the party liked it. So let me introduce you to Labor Louis. Labor Louis was a campaign poster that the CCF nationally produced in I remember what election it was. It was, I want to say 45 or 46. It was after the CCF had won in Saskatchewan, and this national party was telling working people through their cartoon Labor Louis that look at what's going on in Saskatchewan. So Labor Louis is from Saskatchewan. He goes on a trip across Canada to see what it's like to be a worker in other parts of the country, and the cartoon is amazing. I can't wait to put it in my book. Where it basically says everywhere else in Canada isn't very good because they're not electing CCF governments, and you go through each province, and Labor Louis is shocked to see that he can't organize, that there's no minimum wage, that there's all kinds of problems. But oh my gosh, he gets back to Saskatchewan, everything's okay for Labor Louis because he gets vacation pay and he gets all these different things, and he's really happy to be in Saskatchewan as a working person. So vote CCF. So it's a really cool cartoon. I'm burning through it because I'm running out of time, but if you want a copy of this, I'm happy to share it with you. Okay, this is I don't know, Dylan, can you see this okay?
Yes, yes.
Sorry, Graham, you said that. Can you see this okay? So I love this graph. So I took this from the Department of Labor statistics in the 1960s. And you can see that, as I said earlier, the working class in Saskatchewan is pretty quiet, it's pretty tame, and it's also, there's not many organized workers. But look what happens in 1944. So 1944 is when the act is passed, and then essentially it's an avalanche of organizing, and you just see the amazing amounts of growth in the labor movement after 1944. Like there's no other variable that explain this other than you have an act and a government that is promoting unionization and doing so unapologetically. And that labor wasn't always happy, and sometimes they'd fight, and sometimes they had collective bargaining disputes, and there was a couple strikes, but like that's healthy, I would argue. But anyway, nevertheless, like you can see how the movement expands because there's legislation promoting it. I know that seems fairly straightforward, but to me the numbers are very stark, and it's quite clear that it works. right? And you can see that this is a better way to see it. Like you can just see how aggressive this legislation is and how much it works to promote the organized working classes to organize. It levels off by the 1960s, and arguably that's because the act needed to be expanded into areas where labor had sort of saturated itself, especially in the public sector and in industry. And the CCF, I think, was slow to respond to that. Gets a little better in the 70s. It's not as good in the 90s, but you can see that a government that wants to promote organization amongst working people has the ability if it's willing to put in the political capital. And that's the lesson, I think, here. Yeah, there are strikes, right? And so you saw those earlier numbers. I think this hopefully shows a little better. Graham was pointing out that it was a little hard to see. You can see that it's okay. Strikes are okay. They're actually healthy because sometimes they'll disagree, but you have a promotion of this sort of this militancy. And these are just showing the same numbers, the number of employees. But you can just really see that when you have a government that promotes it and a party that understands it, good things can happen. So I think I'm going to end it there on that one. How's my time going? I'm just going to close this. Sorry. Oh, I'm really low. Okay, so that's a bit of the history. I want to share with you a few data points. I'm not going to bother with this because I'm going to run out of time. I want to share with you a few data points in here. So fast forward to today. What do we know about work and labor today? And here the picture gets a little bit more grim, I think, for working people. Okay, what's going on here? I'm gonna stop sharing that. Sorry about this, people. I'm going to share again. This, okay. Okay. So how do I, the little bar, the zoom bar is above me. I can't get to where I can expand. Does anybody know how to move the zoom bar? Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about this. This is what Rob was saying about technology not working properly, and I'm making an excuse for it. Okay, so I just want to show you the trends since the 1970s, and this is national, not provincial data. And this is where I'm hoping it's getting into some relevancy for today. And I know I'm getting short on time, so I won't spend a lot of time. But here's the general trend in workers joining unions since the 1970s. And it's not a great story. It's a decline. It's a massive decline. People know this, but I just think it's worth emphasizing when you see the raw data that this is a movement that's not growing and by leaps and bounds, but is really struggling. And by no means is that a criticism of labor today, but it does recognize that if these trends continue, it's not going to be good for working people. And I would put to you that one of the reasons why we're having and we're seeing discussions today about working people voting conservative, aligning with the conservatives, joining so-called freedom protests is partially because they don't have access to the institutions that would lead them in other more progressive directions. You didn't see union flags at the freedom protests, and I'm going to put that in quotation marks because we know that there's a lot of real questions about that concept that we need to problematize. But you don't see union flags there, right? And there's a reason for that, right? Because workers in unions tend to have a political worldview that we may not always agree with, but it's much different than the unorganizing working class that sees it in a different way. And I would put to you right now, conservative movements and even farther right movements are starting to appeal to working people in problematic ways that we need to actually take very seriously. That's me being out of time, I bet. But I'm almost done. I got 5 minutes and I'm done, I promise. Okay, so that's a snapshot since the 1940s. You see growth and then you see decline.
Quickly, I'll just say, we have a few people in attendance who are vision impaired. So the just if you could describe when you put up.
Sorry.
But you're good. You're good.
Okay. So from 1946, you see growth. You see a decline in the 70s, a little bit of bump in the 80s, but the neoliberal sort of assault that begins arguably in Saskatchewan and BC and takes hold on the federal scene by late in the 1970s. Takes its toll. So since the 1990s, you continue to see a decline well into the 2020s. Please don't see that little bump in 2019-20 as a shining light. The more I dug into that data, what it showed is that unionization as a percentage of all employees in the workforce went up because most union workers in the public sector stayed on the job and weren't laid off, whereas many private sector workers were. So that small bump in unionization rates doesn't reflect a rebirth or a growth. It's not great. Here is actually, I think, the most important data point for today is that public sector unionization is quite healthy. From 1997 until 2020, you see that there's actually a growth in public sector unionization. Unions in the public sector are healthy. Workers in the public sector are well protected by unions. I wouldn't call it saturation, but it's pretty close. But where we see a massive decline is in the private sector, from 20% in the mid 1990s to under 14 today. And that trend has continued. So private sector unionization continues to decline quite dramatically. I'm not going to bother with this because I'm running out of time. There's just two other slides I want to point you to. This one I find fascinating. So Stats Canada has a bunch of different data points with regards to unionization and who's in unions. And there's 2 points I want to point you to, and I'm actually going to start on this one: unionization by male and female membership. When you think of a unionized worker today, the first image that comes into your mind is a white guy with a tool in his hand and a hard hat on his head. That's not who the typical union member is today, according to data. The data says that the typical union member is a woman, works probably in the public sector, in long-term care or in healthcare or in education. That's the typical union member today. Women are by far higher represented than men in the unionized sector. Now, here's the other one I wanted to show you that I think about this sometimes, and I don't quite know how to interpret it, other than that when you look at who's in unions, not just by gender, and Stats Canada has only recently begun looking at stats by race. So we should have a better data set in terms of the ethnic breakdown of who's in unions. And I'm looking forward to that data. We don't actually know that right now. So I'm looking forward to Stats Canada being able to publish that. That was a recent change in legislation that allowed it to do it. But in education, it's really interesting. Now, part of this is because the public sector is the driving force of unionization today. But unionization by education suggests that a party that is aggressively pro-labor, right, that can think beyond the box, that can think about what a 21st century Labor Relations Act would look like to get workers who are in precarious labor, to get workers who are working in multiple jobs, for Starbucks or for Uber or for Uber Eats or whatever, the job you can think of that has no union representation. If we can be bold and think beyond the box about what a Labor Relations Act would look like in 2022 to get those workers into unions, then we start to address the march of the far right amongst working people. And I think that's a really important place for us to think about in 2022. All right, I'm going to end there. I'm sorry that I went over time. I knew I would. I was hoping I'd get there, but I'm going to end on that. So thank you, and please rip it apart and challenge me in every level because I love it, because I'm learning like you are, and hopefully it will help with my book. So thanks.